Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad we're here. I'm glad I made it. Made it in.
Mhm.
Uh, and perhaps in a little bit about of irony and tongue in cheek, of course. We're studying Job today,
Yay!
Oh,
which is
Studying
full
what
of
in here?
fun experiences. A little bit of Job today.
Show.
A little bit of Job. Uh, okay. Job is one of those books that I think people are generally familiar sort of with the story of Job, but few people have actually read the actual book itself because it is not an easy read. The book of Job is actually probably amongst the top five, maybe it might even be number one of the most difficult books to read in the Bible for a number of reasons. One, its actual theme is very tricky, but also the language is very hard. It's actually one of the hardest to read because the language is a mess. The Hebrew that they use, there's a lot of gently put grammatical anomalies in the text. It's written about out of the 42 chapters of Job, about 35 of them are written, I think it takes 39 of them are actually written in poetic verse, which makes it, again, a little tricky. And it has my favorite expression, one of my favorite scholarly expressions. It has more examples of a hapax legomenon than any other book of the Bible. What is a hapax legomenon for 5 points?
Yes, what is?
Don't know.
Oh, a hapax legomenon is a Greek expression meaning said only once. So the book of Job has words in Hebrew that are written only once and they're never used again in the entire Bible.
Mm.
So when it comes to translating these words, you don't have anything to compare it to. So you have to really try to get it from context of what the word actually means. So it becomes very hard to decipher sometimes when you have a noun or a verb that isn't used anywhere else in the Bible. So you have to almost guess what it means from the sentence. And so the Bible, it happens every once in a while, depending on what book of the Bible you're in. But for Job, there's a lot of them. So you're just sort of like straining to sort of figure out from context what the words actually mean. Um, we're going to do a little bit of a general overview of the story. Before we even get to the book of Job, right? There was likely a story of Job, right? So Job as a narrative, a tale, almost like a morality play about teaching, about man's role, a person's role as it relates to God and about religion, right? And so the tale we're familiar with, and again in that broader context, Job is the righteous man who suffers, right? And Job in this story and this idea is very patient. You've heard the expressions, the patience of Job. Someone who, is really patient despite all the obstacles. There's a concept of being patient like Job, even in the face of all these trials and tribulations. That Job, by the way, disappears a little bit in the actual book of Job because the book of Job, which we're going to read, isn't all that patient and isn't all that quiet or humble in the face of the problems that he faces. But we see this story being picked up not only in the Bible but in the Midrash and Christian texts, actually even in the Quran as well. Because he was thought to be this really great, really wise sage and an example, a model of piety. So this story, right, of Job gets passed down from generation to generation until we get to an author, a poet who decides, let me take this story and really play with it, make a book out of it, right? This is about 5th century, 4th century BCE. And so what he does that's a little bit different is he makes a story not about Job and God and Job and his wife, but it's about Job. The meat of the story is Job and his fair weather friends, perhaps. He has three buddies that come to talk to him for the better part of 25 chapters about what's going on in Job's life and what he has to do. Job is not Jewish, Job is not an Israelite in the story. He's never presented as such. He is most likely probably an Edomite from Edom, because we have a sense of where he's from. It gives us that he's from Utz, he's from Uz, that's his homeland, which is in Edom. And the story, primarily when it comes to using God's name, in the narrative sections, it'll use the Yud Hey Vav Hey, it'll use Tetragrammaton, but in the actual story itself, it'll use El or Shaddai or Eloha, which are more general terms for God that existed pre-Israelite, right? So we often see, we've maybe heard the term El Shaddai, right, as one of the names for God. Shaddai was a place in Israel, right, or in the land, and so the God of Shaddai was the God of that region, and he's this Godhead is eventually incorporated into the Israelite Godhead, where he becomes the same as Adonai, right? So this becomes a name for God as opposed to a separate deity. So there's a little bit of like paganness in the book. We don't get a lot of sense of we get no sense, I should say, of covenant. No really specific Israelite items. Job is just a dude, and it's supposed to be, I think, make it more universal, right? So that anyone can read this story and connect to it. That it doesn't have to be only about an Israelite, but it can be about somebody who is like the everyman, Job the everyman. But what it also does is that Job, by not being an Israelite, by not being from Jerusalem or or Beersheba or another sort of big biblical location, it takes him out of sort of the biblical narrative. It takes him out of biblical space and puts him in his own space, right? We have no time for the story. It doesn't say where or it doesn't say when it occurs. It's like almost like, think about prehistoric times, something like the Flintstones. He's taking place somewhere in an alternate reality. So that makes it easier then, if you take Job out of the historical narrative, if you take him out of any kind of biblical idea of what the relationship between Job and God is supposed to be, it allows you to be subversive. It allows you to be a little bit more controversial than saying, well, Job is an Israelite who kept kosher, and now has all these problems. It allows the author to play more with the story and perhaps be a little bit more creative with it. And Job, we find, the story has a really interesting structure. I mentioned the poetic part of it, which I'll come back to in a minute. But even the debates he has with his friends, there's a very specific structure. So the story starts off with narrative, right? Job, and he's righteous. God argues with Satan, the adversary. They come up with this idea about the righteous man, but he's only righteous because he doesn't suffer. Then it goes into the poetry. Job speaks, first. He gives a little bit of a rant, which we're going to read today. And then his three buddies come to talk to him. First buddy, Eliphaz, speaks. Job rebuts. Bildad speaks. Job rebuts. Zophar speaks. Job rebuts. That's the first round. That round is repeated a second time in the exact same structure. And then it's repeated one final time for the third part, which it gets interrupted in the middle. But there's a very specific flow and a structure to the book. It's actually interrupted. So we have this third flow. Eliphaz talks. Job talks. Bildad cuts in a little bit. And then Job begins to monologue. He has a sort of a bigger speech, which is actually then cut off by a random chapter of poetry that gets put in, not as part of the story. But it's called a meditation on wisdom. It has no author, just a dude talking about wisdom and sort of almost like reflecting on the story. Then you have four more poems by another dude who disappears. Elihu, appears and gives four speeches, about sort of the theme of the text. And then God, in the end, responds. You get God's 2 chapters of a response to Job and this whole thing. God, when God comes down to speak to Job, God ain't happy, right? There's a lot of biblical sarcasm, if one can say it. That God is sarcastic, God is petulant, God is angry. But even though it appears that it is directed at Job, it actually then gets deflected off him and to his friends, which is a little bit weird because Job is being the protagonist. Job's the one who's complaining about all the stuff that's going on. And again, Job isn't quiet about his disapproval about his lot in life. It's a lot of self-pitying. It's a lot of just anger and a lot of depression about his fate. And, he maintains his innocence. God comes down and starts smacking people around. But in the end, God isn't smacking Job around as much as he's smacking around the friends, that are there, these fair weather friends, which is very interesting because it hooks onto, I think, a very interesting point. God affirms Job in a way. Job is in the right when Job says that Job's suffering is unjust, and his friends are wrong, maintaining that God is just. That's a fascinating theological point. The friends are chastised for basically saying that God is always right, or that God's decisions are always just. Job gets praised for recognizing a very difficult truth that sometimes, put maybe a different way, sometimes life stinks, and sometimes things are arbitrary, and sometimes you don't get to know the answer. That we search for meaning, but we don't always find it. And God says that's actually right. And Job is praised for that recognition, where his friends are basically condemned for hanging on to ancient wisdom, this idea that God's rulings, God's mercies are always understandable, to us, and that if you do good, good happens. If you do bad, bad happens. God says, you know what? Sometimes it don't work that way. Sometimes life is just a little bit more rotten and you don't get to know. So by Job understanding this deeper theological truth that God's management of the world is sometimes, to us, to be fair, to us, sometimes feels arbitrary, that's actually okay. It's okay to say that. It's okay to believe that. And in fact, again, it's almost an affirmation that God is saying, Job, you know what? You got it right. And, Huey, Dewey, and Louie over there, your buddies, they got it wrong. They think it's simple. Life isn't simple. Life is complicated. And that's why Job gets praised, where his friends get smacked around a bit. So with all of that said, there's a lot to say, but with all of that said, let's actually jump into the text itself, because I know that's sort of what we're waiting for, to do that. And as we continue with the reading, I'll chime in some other points. But it is really the text itself, the translation that I'm using here, is the best I can find. Frankly, if we had more time and energies and more copyright issues, we can maybe scan in some better translations and email a packet instead. But we're sort of using the best that we got. And so if it feels a little stilted, it's a combination of the translation being a little, and frankly, it's a poetic text. It's meant to be a little complicated, a little tricky. One even can say that the author tortures the language in order to show us a tormented soul. That there's actually a method to the madness, that he's using this complex language, this convoluted language, because life is convoluted and life is complex. Probably not the case, but I like that idea nonetheless. I think it's nice. Okay, with all of that said, let's dive in to, again, a fantastic story. A little rough in parts, I'm going to warn everybody. A little rough in parts, but we're going to do our level best. Okay. Debbie Siegel, you see the text over there?
I do.
You do? You want to read this first paragraph?
I certainly will. Chapter 1. There was a man in the land of, do you pronounce it Uz or Ooze?
It's probably better Utz. There we go. Utz.
Okay. There was a man in the land of Uz named Job. That man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very large household. That man was wealthier than anyone in the East.
Okay, so we're setting it up, right? Job's got a lot of stuff. He's a good guy, blameless guy, does all the right things. He feared slash revered, one can use if one prefers, but he fears God, he shuns evil. He's got beautiful family, got his 10 kids, has just a ton of good stuff, all these oxen and sheep and camels, just living large, living the good life. Wealthier than anyone else in the East. That's about it that we get in terms of Job's backstory. Remember, it doesn't say in the time of King Ahab or, we don't get any of that. Job's just a dude who's hanging out, a lot of money, a lot of prestige. One will get the impression during the story that Job is somebody who has a lot of kavod in the community. He's got a lot of good standing. He's respected. He's somebody of not only of means, but somebody who carries a lot of weight in the community. Sharon, you want to pick up from there? You got to unmute? Okay. It was the custom.
It was the custom of his sons to hold feasts, each on his set day in his own home. They would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a round of feast days was over, Job would send word to them to sanctify themselves, and rising early in the morning, he would make burnt offerings, one for each of them. For Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned and blasphemed God in their thoughts. This is what Job always used to do.
So this is our sense of Job's ritual, right? I mean, we can try to place it in a context of Israelite religion, but we don't really have it. Certainly we had sacrifices, we had maybe a feast. Who doesn't like a little bit of barbecue? It's fine. So, we have this whole context here of it's setting it up. So we have the feasts start to show that they're pious, right? Job is telling them, hey, make sure after you enjoy all your good stuff, a little bit of vino, make sure that you make a sacrifice, make an offering, make sure that you're on the right path. And Job himself would say, you know what, I'm going to make offerings on behalf of my kids, just in case they might screw up. I'm righteous, so to speak. Let's make sure my kids are fine too. I want to cover all of my bases. Job is a covering all of his bases kind of guy, right? He wants to make sure everything is going well. And again, he's living a very pious life. Okay, so that's what we got for Job. Leah, you want to keep reading? You got to unmute. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, one day.
One day the divine beings presented themselves before the Eternal, and the adversary came along with them. The Eternal said to the adversary, "Where have you been?" The adversary answered the Eternal, "I have been roaming all over the earth." The Eternal said to the adversary, "Have you noticed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil."
Isn't that nice, right? And so right away we get this interjection here of the adversary, Satan, which is later going to become Satan in Christian tradition. The adversary comes in, and God and Satan engage in a little banter, a little back and forth. Where have you been? You know what? I've been schlepping all over the earth, maybe causing a little mischief, misplacing people's laundry and whatnot. I've been going around causing troubles. Now he only has one sock. It's going to be great. He's out there just causing problems for everybody. And the Eternal then says, hey, while you've been roaming around causing mischief, all that good stuff, take a look at my boy Job here. What a good guy. Is there a better one around? I don't think so. No one's like him. He's awesome.
Bragging.
Yeah, a little bragging, right? Schleppen nachas, as we say. A little bragging, and that's not what you want. So God's sort of poking the bear a little bit here. God's sort of setting Job up, it feels like a little bit to me. You don't want to draw Satan's eye here, but nonetheless, here we are. But like a proud papa, right? He's going to say, hey, look at Job. He's just the best. Who's better than Job? Nobody. Okay, Renee, you want to pick up there?
The adversary answered the Eternal, "Does Job not have good reason to fear God? Why is it you have fenced him round, him and his household and all that he has? You have blessed his efforts so that his possessions spread out in the land. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you and your face." The Eternal replied to the adversary, "See, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on him." The adversary departed from the presence of the Eternal.
Okay, very good. And so the adversary now has a point to make, right? Of course, Job is this pious, righteous dude. Look at all the good stuff he has. And in fact, God, you gave him all this stuff. So why wouldn't he praise you? You gave him all these possessions, all these camels and these oxen and these donkeys, and he has kids and he has land and he has everything. He's got 4 cars in the garage. You got a big swimming pool, right there. He's got all this great stuff. Of course, he's going to be happy. But what happens if you mess with him a little bit? What happens if you take all that stuff away? Then he won't bless you. He'll curse you instead. He'll curse you right to your face, right? Really just provocative language. So God, of course, says, sure, why not? Go down there and mess with him a little bit. Take, his possessions away, mess with his stuff, but don't touch him. We're gonna draw a line here. Don't touch him. We don't need that. Don't lay a hand on his person. We can mess with his stuff. Sandy asked the question about the belief system of Job, right? And so, in the word we're going to use here, which is not the nicest word per se, but I think it is an accurate depiction, is pagan. That we're going to have him sort of be somebody who probably has a belief in the gods of his neighborhood, the gods of his town, of his city, and his friends as well. To probably have their belief in, look, don't make God angry, but is it God with a capital G? Like, in terms of when we talk about God, in terms of Adonai, in the text, they don't use it, as much. They use it, again, in a couple narrative sections, but when the voice comes from Job, when Job speaks, with one exception, it's usually, El or Shaddai or Eloha, which, can be used interchangeably sometimes in the Bible for the Israelite God, but also were used to describe lesser, sort of lower deities as well, and eventually they become subsumed into the Israelite religion instead. Similar to how the Christians used that with the Roman deities and found ways to turn the Roman deities into sublimate them into the Christian worship system. Sort of like moving Christmas to December 25th to match up with Saturnalia. So it's finding different ways of connecting the dots for people so they don't feel like the transition is too abrupt. So Job is probably, again, someone who we would consider, or the Israelites would consider more of a pagan at this point. And so the adversary says, hey, look, let me mess with him and see what happens. And God says, sure, why not? Now, this, by the way, helps us. The narrative, I should say, gives us a little bit of a backdrop. It's a fascinating rhetorical device. We know the story already, because we're actually seeing this not from Job's perspective. We're seeing it from God's perspective, right? And the adversary's perspective. We know the answer already. Job is righteous. Job is pious. No one's going to make the argument in the first 2 chapters that he's not. Job's doofus friends come along and they think he's a bad person, but we know the answer already from God's own lips, so to speak, that Job is righteous. So when we hear the argumentation that Job's friends are going to levy at him, we already know the score. We already know that Job is fine and Job is righteous, right? And so, by setting it up this way, there's no big reveal that like Job is a serial killer. You know, like we know that's not the case. Job's a good dude. And the test is going to be what happens when the righteous dude suffers, which is going to explode the heads of Job's friends who can't live in that world, right? And Job is the one who's living in the gray, where his friends need a black and white world. And God is now, again, allowing Satan to test this theory out, to test what's going on. So now the fun begins. Now we get to have a little bit of a ruckus. Brahms, you want to give me a little reading? You got to unmute.
One day, as the sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the she-asses were grazing alongside them when Sabeans attacked them and carried them off and put the servants to the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you.
How lucky, because we need to have someone to tell the tale, right? Okay, so the oxen and the she-asses, and now the Sabaeans come and kill everybody, except for one dude who survives. Fair enough. Tyler, you want to get the next paragraph?
Yeah. This one was speaking when another came out and said, God's fire fell from heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them all. I alone have escaped to tell you.
And the hits keep coming. Tyler, give me one more.
Which one, Melissa?
This one.
Yes.
This one was still speaking when another came and said, Shaledium, formation of 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off and put the servants to the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you.
Okay, and so there's Job sitting on his couch, having some grapes, maybe watching a little Netflix, having a grand old time, being fine. All of a sudden, these dudes come in. Oh, by the way, all of your oxen and all of your she-asses, they're all dead, along with all the servants you had. A bummer, right? That's not how you want to start your day. The man's barely had his coffee yet, and he's got all this mishigas coming to him. Then the next dude comes, oh, by the way, divine fire came and blew up all your stuff, all these sheep and servants. They're all dead too. Okay, Job's having a really rough morning. And then that one hasn't even finished speaking yet. And now get the Babylonians, these Chaldeans coming in and killing another whole mess of people. All the camels are dead too. And all these servants. Not the way to be, right? And so this is not a good morning for Job. Of course, it needs to be a little bit worse because it's Job. Sandy, do you want to pick up here? You got to unmute. There you go.
There we go. This one was still speaking when another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, when suddenly a mighty wind came from the wilderness. It struck the 4 corners of the house, so that it collapsed upon the young people, and they died. I alone have escaped to tell you.
Ay. So there go the kids, okay? Had those 10 sons and daughters. A little big wind came from the wilderness. House collapsed. Everyone's dead. Okay, so in the span of 3 minutes, Job has lost basically all of his possessions, and even worse for last, he loses his family. He loses all these children. So pretty bad, a pretty rotten way of being. So by the way, not touching Job's person didn't really help Job out that much. Satan had more than enough to work with in terms of taking away everything that Job held dear. But what do we see very next? A very famous passage. Linda White, you want to pick up there?
Then Job arose, tore his robe, cut off his hair, and threw himself on the ground, and laid there prostrate, and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Eternal has given, and the Eternal has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Eternal. For all that, Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach on God.
Okay. Oi, as we say. So Job is clearly distressed, as one would expect. Job is really, brought down low, quite literally. In this case, he throws himself on the floor. But he says, you know what? Adonai Natan Adonai Lakach. Yehi Shem Adonai Mivarach. God has given, God has taken away. Blessed be the name of God. And so, even in the throes, the depths of all this sorrow, he does not, sin, and he doesn't cast reproach. He doesn't rebuke. Doesn't rebuke God. That's how we start our story, my friends. That's our opening sort of salve, our opening narrative here. And so we know from the story, again, that Job is righteous, but we are immediately presented with again, I will call it a subversive, provocative problem. The righteous person who suffers, and not only who suffers, but does so with God's fairly explicit approval, basically. God sort of gives the green light to Satan and to allow him to do this. Taking a step back for a second, one might ask, rightly, oi, this book does not sound like one that would be in the Bible because it doesn't jibe with what we learn from the Torah, let's say, or from the prophets. And so there's an inclination to look at Job as an outlier. And in a way, it is. We have Ecclesiastes, certainly, as well, that sort of tend to be more on this pessimistic, skeptical, sort of cynical side of observance and of faith, and of really questioning how the world works, and it just doesn't really fall into line with other biblical themes and biblical ideas. But we have to remember that, and we'll use the word unorthodox in a way, but in that time period, the beliefs in the Israelite tradition, they didn't have to be as homogenous, right, as they're going to be a little bit later on with the Talmud, right? There's going to be room in the Bible for different ideas and different themes. And so this being one that's a little bit different, again, much like Ecclesiastes, is not a deal breaker, right? It's not something where people are going to look at it and go, this shouldn't be here. But in fact, one could even I'll commend the people who canonized the Bible, who put it all together by taking a book like this, which is no doubt challenging, and incorporating it within the Bible, right? It shows to me that the biblical compilers were perhaps okay with the idea of some of these different stories and texts not being all the same, with the same ideas and the same themes. It recognizes maybe a diversity of opinion, but it also recognizes that sometimes, as I mentioned early on, things don't go according to plan, and Job voices a lot of these emotions. It's a very evocative book, as we're going to see. But it's also, so through the poetry, I should say, through the conversations, through the deliberations, it makes us think a little bit more about what it means to be in a relationship with God, and what our role is sort of in the world, the limitations of human knowledge. It's tackling a lot of very big questions. And I like the idea that the Israelites, the early compilers of the Bible, were not afraid of a book that asks very difficult questions of us. That's a little PSA on my end of it for Job. Okay. Let's continue now. That was a fun chapter. So let's get to chapter 2. Gary, you want to pick up?
Okay, chapter 2. The day the divine beings presented themselves before the Eternal, the adversary came along with them to present himself before the Eternal. The Eternal said to the adversary, "Where have you been?" The adversary answered the Eternal, "I have been roaming all over the earth." The Eternal said to the adversary, "Have you noticed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. He still persists in his innocence. So you have incited me against him to destroy him for no good reason.
Okay, so we get a little bit of a rehash here, you know, a little bit of we've tried this experiment. Let's see how it's going. Got to check back in, a little data collection, right? So everyone's back together. The adversary's back and says, "Hey, I've been roaming along. What did I miss? You know, what's going on?" God said, "Hey, look at this. You made this whole stink about Job and about he'd be a blasphemer. You know, if his life got a little bit harder. You made his life pretty hard, and you know what? Still pious, still righteous, doesn't sin, does the right things, even though all this stuff has happened." And again, one can see God elbowing him a little bit, hey, look at this, he's still great. You lose. You lose this bet, Satan. Of course, the story doesn't end there because we still have to mess with Job a little bit more. Tony, you want to pick up? You have to unmute. There you are.
The adversary answered the Eternal, "Skin for skin, all that a man has he will give up for his life. But lay a hand on his bones and his flesh, and he will surely blaspheme you and to your face." So the Eternal said to the adversary, "See, he is in your power, only spare his life." The adversary departed from the presence of the Eternal and inflicted a severe inflammation on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head.
Dude can't catch a break. So now he has this huge skin infection. Satan is saying, "Hey, look, he didn't curse you because he knows that if he curses you, you're going to kill him. So he's doing it to save his own hide. That's why he didn't curse you. It's not that he's so pious. It's just that, he wants to save his life. But begin to afflict his actual body, then he'll curse out and he'll cry out." So, of course, God says, "Yeah, why not? Let's give it a shot." It's this theological experiment that's happening, and Job is the guinea pig. And so now Job gets all these afflictions, all these sores, inflammation. Not a happy day. Bonnie, you want to pick up there? He took a shard.
He took a shard to scratch himself as he sat in ashes. His wife said to him, "You still persist in your innocence. Blaspheme God and die." But he said to her, "You talk as any shameless woman might talk. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil?" For all that, Job said nothing sinful.
A really nice exchange between husband and wife here. Not very supportive either way. So there's poor Job. The imagery is just spectacular, but there's poor Job in his sackcloth and ashes, everything taken away from him. He's covered in boils or scabs, whatever it's going to be. It's gross. And he's there with a little bit of rock, a little bit of a stick, whatever it is. He's just scratching himself all over because it's gross, but he wants some relief from all of the unpleasantness. And his wife says, "What are you doing? You're obviously terrible. How can you still maintain your innocence? You're obviously doing something horrible because ancient wisdom would say you're done wrong, or else why would all this bad stuff be happening to you? So you know what? You're not even redeemable anymore, right? It's over, Job. It's over, Rocky. You're done. So why don't you just give in, curse God, and you'll be dead, and it'll be over. Let's finish this." And Job says, "You know what? Unacceptable. Not going to do that. I disagree with your assertion." He puts it a little bit more bluntly than that, but he disagrees. But then this next sentence is spectacular in terms of just giving us some idea of the themes of the story. "Should we only accept good from God and not accept evil? Can I only praise God when things are going my way? Can I only praise God when life is just turning up, roses for me all the time? Sometimes life stinks, but I still believe in God anyway. I'm going to accept all the good that I get, and I'm going to accept the bad that I get, because that might be just part of what's going on. So I can't curse, I can't blaspheme God, I can't be sinful, because maybe this is all just part of what it is." Very interesting because right off the bat, it sort of gives you that idea. It sounds a little passive per se, but it sort of gives an insight into Job. That Job says, look, all comes from God, right? Good and bad. So I accept the good with a smile, and I accept the bad, maybe not with a smile, but I accept that might be part of existence right now. And Job, then says nothing sinful. So that's our setup, right? So the wife's no help, kids are dead, all of his possessions, alternatively carried off, burned, or slaughtered. His possessions are gone. And now he's just there sitting in the dust with a stick and scabs all over him. Okay, good times had by all. And now, his three friends here are going to come to console him, right? Because that is really, remember, so well, let's read it first, and then I'll give a little explanation. So, Linda Bilo, you want to pick up when Job's three friends?
Sure. When Job's three friends heard about all these calamities that had befallen him, each came from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They met together to go and console and comfort him.
Indeed. Okay. And actually, Linda, can you give me one more? When they saw him?
When they saw him from a distance, they could not recognize him, and they broke into loud weeping. For each one tore his robe and threw dust into the air onto his head. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. None spoke a word to him, for they saw how very great was his suffering.
Okay, thank you for that. That's perfect. Not for Job, but it's perfect. So I appreciate that. So now Job's buddies come, right? His posse. They come, and because look, these might be good dudes, right? We don't have a whole lot of backstory on these guys, but they're friends. They're hearing of all these troubles, and they're schlepping, from all the different locations, and their purpose is to go console and comfort, right? So the intention is very good. It's fascinating to me, right? And so that's their goal, because they want to comfort him in his time of grief. How they comfort him is going to be the question, right? How they console him is going to be where it gets meaty, where it gets juicy, here for us. But the first part is really, I think, brilliant writing in a way, and it has a lot of, I think, really good thoughts to it. That first, he's brought down to a point so low they can't even recognize him anymore, right? I look at that sentence and I read it a couple different ways. First, they can't physically recognize him, right? Because he's cut off all of his hair, he's in the dirt, he's got the sackcloth and ashes, he's got the boils all over him. They can't even recognize him physically. If you've had the experience, and it's sometimes difficult to reflect upon, I know I've certainly had it, where you might visit somebody you haven't seen in a little while, maybe they're in the hospital, they're not feeling good, and whatever disease, whatever malady they have, it's really caused such a significant physical change that it is striking to look at them, and very sort of upsetting. You sort of see them and you go, oh my God, you can't even recognize the person because of what they have endured physically. And it's a very difficult and very dramatic moment, very traumatic moment, I should say, and there's no response to that really, except for grief, and so they're weeping, they're tearing their own robes off, and throwing dust, sort of like grandiose acts of mourning. But I also think about they couldn't recognize him, meaning that they couldn't really see the man that was their friend, this person of a high stature, right, of prestige, of esteem. They couldn't see that person anymore because of how profound the grief was at this moment, how bad everything has gone for him. They can't see their friend anymore. He's sort of lost in this grief, which is a very hard thing to see when it comes to a friend, right? And so this is the best part I can say for the friends, is that, and I wish it almost ended here with the friends, is that what do? They try their best to empathize with him, and they recognize that perhaps the best thing they could say in this moment is nothing at all, right? So that, because what words can you say in such a moment of grief and of mourning and of trouble? So they sit with him. They sit on the ground with him. They sit next to him. They comfort him by their presence, right?
Sitting Shiva.
Like sitting Shiva, exactly right. Right. So they're just like, sort of sitting with him, and they haven't spoken anything to him because they're waiting for him to start, right? They're waiting for him to talk first because they don't know what to say yet. You know, they have nothing to say that will comfort or console, but they're comforting and consoling just by their presence, which is really a beautiful image. You know, when we think about it, this idea that, you know, for those of us who have been, and I'm sure we all have, to our fair share of Shiva minions, you know, and sort of visiting the home of a mourner, it's an uncomfortable space, you know, for many people, right? It's an uncomfortable sort of place to be because we don't know what to say, you know, or do in a house of mourning. And there is a push in our own brains often to sort of like try to engage, but almost like in chit chat. Like we don't want to delve into the feelings because the loss is there. The loss is too great. There's a lot of, you know, sadness and grief. And so it's easier to sort of push that away and sort of engage in a little bit more surface, you know, conversation because it's hard, you know, in that moment. So that's what I think about here is that, you know, they're not trying to, you know, distract the mourner. They're not trying to say, hey, you know, sorry about your loss. You see how the Bucks did on Sunday, kind of, you know, like that. They're not doing that. They're just sort of sitting, and they're waiting, and they're listening, or they're about to listen. If only it would end there for the friends, because then they start talking, and they sort of ruin this nice little idea, perhaps, of understanding perhaps the role of somebody who wants to comfort and console somebody. That sometimes you don't need words, just presence. Words are good too sometimes, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it's just presence that can be helpful. Now, of course, Job begins to talk. And now we get into a little bit of a riot here because I mentioned in the very beginning, I think in the original sort of story, in the almost a fable version of Job that was being passed on from generation to generation, it was more Job suffers and Job is patient, and then God sort of responds, and, you know, and it's a nicer ending. Job's going to talk now, and this is going to be a little rough. I'm just going to put a little bit of a warning on this. You know, this is a little rough in terms of his speech because he's upset. And as I noted, I think one of the beauties of this book is that it is very evocative. And this is, I put it in paragraph form, but this is now starts the poem, right? So this is Job's poem of lament, his poem of sadness that he's not going to speak to his friends. Eric and Tanya, you there? I see Cisco's, but I see them muted. So much if they're there. There's no picture. Okay. With that said, we'll go. Oh, wait.
Rabbi.
Hey, how you guys doing?
Good.
You want to read a little bit?
Sure.
Okay, I lost you, but you're somewhere. There you are. Okay, I got
Uh-oh.
you. Okay, I got you. Okay, go right ahead. Afterward,
Job began to speak. Afterward, Job began to speak and cursed the day of his birth. Job spoke up and said, "Perish the day on which I was born, and the night it was announced. A male has been conceived. May that day be darkness. May God above have no concern for it. May light not shine on it. May darkness and deep gloom reclaim it. May a pall lie over it. May what blackens the day terrify it.
keep going.
May obscurity carry off that night. May it not be counted among the days of the year. May it not appear in any of its months. May that night be desolate. May no sound of joy be heard in it. May those who cast spells upon the day damn it. Men skilled to stir Leviathan. May its twilight stars remain dark. May it hope for light and have none? May it not see the glimmerings of dawn, because it did not block my mother's womb and hide trouble from my eyes.
Yeah.
Very
Sounds like
dramatic.
COVID.
Very what?
Sounds
Dramatic.
like COVID.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of drama here.
Right. Wow.
This is a very long way of saying, I wish I was never born. this is a very long way of his, what's the story? It's a Wonderful Life, which I've actually never seen, but a similar thing here about, like, I wonder what life would be if I wasn't born. Here, a little more dramatic, about the, about this day the whole day shouldn't even exist. This whole day should be blotted from the calendar. It was announced that I'd been conceived. That day should be just erased. Somebody get the white out, get the eraser and take it off the calendar. And it really becomes very dramatic throughout this text. It's not done yet, by the way, but this whole lament here doesn't sound very patient, right? It doesn't sound very much like, hey, God's great, wonderful, things are, because that's not human, right? Of course he's upset. Of course he's miserable. His entire life is just shattered and falling apart. So the idea of Job sort of like bearing it in good humor or whatever, taking it in stride, is of course ridiculous. Job is going to be very upset, and he is. So his friends are sitting next to him, and finally he just sort of breaks down and goes into this poetic lament about how terrible things are and how he wished he was never born. And so he doesn't curse God, but he cursed the day of his birth. He says this day should never have happened before, and that it didn't a little visceral perhaps, but it didn't block my mother's womb and hide trouble from my eyes. This, by the way, keeps going and it doesn't get any better. So again, just a little bit of a warning, but doesn't get any better than that. Debbie, I think we're back up to you.
Why did I not die at birth, expire as I came forth from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me, or breasts for me to suck? For now I would be lying in repose, asleep and at rest, with the world's kings and counselors who rebuild rooms for themselves, or with nobles who possess gold and who fill their houses with silver. Or why was I not like a stillbirth, hidden, like babies who never saw the light? There the wicked cease from troubling. There rest those whose strength is spent. Prisoners are wholly at ease. They do not hear the taskmaster's voice. Small and great alike are there, and the slave is free of his master.
Okay, and so as I said, doesn't get cheerier on this one at all. Why didn't I die at birth? Like why? And it's very, very visual and very evocative. That when the baby is born, there's always a nurse. That there's someone there to help catch the child. So the knees to receive. You can also refer to the mother's knees as well, but it likely refers to the knees of the person who's catching the baby. And or breasts, to suckle at, and they're like, why should I have nourishment? Because if not, I'd be gone already, and I'd be with other people, who maybe have lived lives and done different things, and they're gone as well. And you know what? This by the way, for those of us who remember the work we did with Ecclesiastes, very similar, from a few weeks ago from Sukkot. Everyone dies at the end, right? And when you die, you don't have any more worries anymore because you're dead. Worry is for the living. Concern and stress and agita and anxiety, that's for people who are alive. People who aren't alive don't have to worry about any of that anymore, right? And so it's the wicked, they can't cause any problems anymore. There's rest for those who are exhausted. Prisoners or people who are slaves are shackled, right? There's no more suffering for them. They don't hear the voice of the taskmaster. And everyone's there, right? Small and great. Everyone dies, right? And the slave is free of his master. And so there is serenity. There's sort of a peacefulness in death, which he longs for after experiencing all this tragedy and all of this trauma. Um, and so again, very, very tough read. That is, no doubt about it. But again, it's meant to be, right? Because here someone is experiencing really the worst depths of human suffering. And so, of course, this person's going to have very emotional, very visceral reactions, as well. You'll see, and again, it's hard because it's in English and not in the Hebrew, but you see a lot of commas in a way that sort of separate phrases. And so, it's a tough one, I guess, to focus on. But these first two lines are actually a pretty good example of what we'll call parallelism here. Why did I not die at birth? Phrase. Expire as I came forth from the womb. Phrase. They both mean the same thing, right? But it's going to be a poetic way of expressing the thought. And so same here. Why were their knees to receive me? That's our phrase, and right below it, you can almost imagine, or breasts for me to suck. So knees and breasts, the parts of the body. Then we have, a verb, as well. So it's going to give you that same idea. So you're going to see that throughout here, that you have phrases separated by a comma to symbolize the poetic narrative in a way that we saw in Proverbs as well, right? That we had these almost a replica, repetitive sort of phrases to help emphasize the point. One can have a question, and we're going to read a little bit more, and then we're going to pause for the cause so I can get home. But the poetry here, right? Again, I think it's meant to be on purpose, because the author says I'm going to use these poetic phrases to carry on the emotion. It's almost like a really sad song has the ability to make us feel things, in a different way than maybe sad words do. That there's a melody, a rhythm to the Hebrew in particular. But the author's choice of making this a poem, I think, does make it more powerful. Sharon, you want to finish us off here? Why is the sufferer?
Okay. Why is the sufferer given light? Why life to men who gag on bile, who wait for death, but it does not come, though they would rather dig for it than gold, whose joy exceeds mere happiness, thrilled to find the grave? Why to the man who has lost his way, because a God has blocked his path? For my sighs are brought to me for bread, and my cries poured out for water. For what I feared has overtaken me. What I dreaded has come upon me. I had no repose, no quiet, no rest, but torment came.
Okay, a really cheery way to finish up for today. But, we have this idea here, again, very similar about, why am I still here, right? Everything that I've loved is taken away from me. Why am I still around? Other people, they wait for death, but they're still hanging around. They're still here to suffer, while other people don't, have that same issue. And that he's almost being sustained, right? He's almost being kept alive by his sighs and his cries, right? I think the author tried to hear a little rhyming, and then the translator tried a little rhyming here for sighs and cries, but the idea being the same. And basically, the worst thing I could think of has happened to me already, right? The worst thing that the worst fate that could have befell me has happened. And so that's Job's cry, right, of lament. And now his doofus friends are going to come and try to help him out. And it doesn't work out so well for the friends. With that said, we're going to pause right there for a minute. And does anyone have some final thoughts and reflections on this very cheery beginning to Job?
Very sad to read.
It is very sad to read.
Poor Job.
Yeah.
Yes, it is a very rough beginning of the story.
But I noticed that he didn't hate God. He just didn't want to be there. He didn't
want to
turn
be
on
there.
God. He didn't turn on God.
Nope, didn't turn on God. And so like it really makes us squirm because we have that bird's eye view. Like we know why this happened, that it wasn't because of Job, it was because of God. And Satan sort of, creating this little experiment, sort of the rat in the maze, kind of experiment here. B.F. Skinner would be proud. But the reality is that this is a very tough moment for Job. Job has had everything taken away from him and is miserable, right? And I think, again, there's sometimes this idea of Job sort of like, it's all good. I'm going to praise God anyway. No, Job's upset. Of course he is. Job is traumatized. Job is miserable. And Job is searching for answers, right? And the struggle of this book is going to be, that question is, how can we explain this? How can we figure this out? Because, there's I think a universal tendency to try to find meaning, right? To try to find an explanation. We have to be able to justify what has happened to us, because the answer of sometimes life isn't great is not very satisfying. And so this, next 20 plus chapters, of this conversation is going to basically be a philosophical, theological debate in poetry, right? Which, if you put that all together and think about how spectacular that is for something that was written a couple thousand years ago plus, right, to engage in that, it's not the same. I'm not gonna lie to you here. It's not the same as Plato, but this is like existential drama that's going on at about the same time, probably, as Plato was doing his thing. The biblical authors were doing their thing, at least for this part of it. And it sort of has a little bit of a Hellenistic, feel to it. But existential crisis, it really is fascinating that the biblical authors felt, compelled to create a story like this, and not only create it, but canonize it, to keep it in the Bible. Because remember, they cut a lot of stuff out of the Bible. It didn't make the cut. It was left on the cutting room floor, which is, by the way, a great segue, just for a cheap plug, to next week's class. Where we're going to, next week, sorry, it's 2 weeks. See, I'm jumping the gun on my calendar. We can do more Job next week. In 2 weeks, we have a little Bible cutting room floor time for us as well. We're going to study an apocryphal text that's connected to Hanukkah. That's going to be in 2 weeks, you see. We're going to study the story of Judith, which will be, I think, very interesting for us to play with. So next week we'll get into Job and his debate with his friends. I mean, you almost have to picture almost like a debate team, almost like a debate club, where you're going to have the friends arguing reason, right? They're going to be arguing logic, and they're going to argue about, well, you must have done something, right? That's what it's going to come to, right? You must have done something to earn this, because that's the way life works. You do good, good happens. You do bad, bad happens. You must have screwed up somewhere. And Job is not coming from a place of reason. Job is coming from a place of emotion. He's coming from a place of grief and saying, how could you say that? How could you say that I deserve this? How could you say it doesn't work? And he wants an explanation. And he wants it from his friends, but more so, he wants it from God. He wants God to come down and say, hey, this is the deal, buddy. This is what happened. And even though that might not be the most, it might not be the easiest thing to accomplish, it turns out he gets his answer. Spoiler alert at the end of the book, right? Because God does come down to answer Job's challenge. And so next week we're going to focus a little bit on the debate between the friends, and we'll see how far we get. I will, as I mentioned before, some of this gets a little bit redundant. It's great poetry and it's great writing, but maybe we're not going to read the entire 27 chapters of poetry. We might skip around a little bit and sort of get to the greater conclusion of the book. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's great to see everybody. Really happy that we get to have this time together. And stay tuned.
Good class. Stay warm,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Yeah, stay
Stay
warm.
safe.
It's almost
Yeah.
60 degrees. You got to be careful.
Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe, everybody. Very important as well. Friday night, special plug. We have, our Shabbat service. Those of you who remember, who attended TBI's Got Talent, a couple of families bid on my sermon topic, and so this Friday night is going to be one of those experiences where I'm going to be giving a sermon based on the topic of two delightful 7-year-olds
Oh my gosh.
have given me my sermon topic.
SpongeBob.
Close. Close. So that's going to be on Friday, and the week after that, we're going to have our Hanukkah, our big Hanukkah celebration. So just stay tuned, okay?
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
All right, everyone, stay well, stay warm, stay
Very
safe.
much, Hannah. Good to see
too.
everybody.
Good to see everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.